28 years since our first non-racial democratic elections. Freedom Day, as you know, is a public holiday commemorating the country's victory over apartheid, but also the promise of a better tomorrow.
The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination.
But here's the reality, though. 28 years later, economically at least, South Africa is said to be worse off than it was before democracy. It is the most unequal country in the world. Corruption, inadequate governance, and record high unemployment. All of these have had a debilitating effect on the youth. Youth unemployment stands at almost 70%. And while initiatives are in place, the results are not trickling down fast enough.
Part of the problem that we have as young people in this country who can't find jobs, who don't have support for our businesses and so on and so forth, it actually lies with some of the policies that we've actually introduced or implemented as a government. The issue of youth unemployment needs everyone on deck. It's not just a government problem, it's a societal problem. But government must also create a conducive environment for all other sectors like the private sector to be able to create the much needed jobs that we really need for young people to be able to really be the future that we say young people are.
Well, there seems to be no way around it. South Africa's youth don't have much to celebrate this upcoming Freedom Day. Solutions are desperately needed. In the words of former ANC leader Oliver Tambo, the children of any nation are its future. A country, a movement that does not value its youth and children does not deserve its future. To unpack this pressing issue further, I have the following panelists joining me. The Director for Special Projects for the Durban University of Technology Vice-Chancellor's Office, that's David Mohale. Political analyst and commentator Mighty Jamie joins me in studio. Youth Employment Service CEO Ravi Naidoo also joining the conversation, as well as the Youth Lab Community Manager Dimpho Lekgeu. All of them joining me in this conversation. Thank you to all of you. I don't even know where to begin, and I suppose, Mighty Jamie, because you are in studio, you can get first take to this. I was trying to think of the inlet of how to begin this conversation, and I thought perhaps a good starting point for me in reflecting on Freedom Day has to do with the quotation from former president, the late Nelson Mandela, at his inauguration. A lot was said. It was a beautiful speech. Among those promises was this line that resonates with me and talks to and helps me put perspective whenever I reflect on Freedom Day. Quote, "Let each know that for each the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves." 28 years later, for broader South Africa, but especially for the youth, do those words ring true?
Well, they ring true at the level of human rights to a degree, not the socio-economic rights, but definitely the political rights. South Africa is one of the countries where you can say whatever you want about Cyril Ramaphosa without there being consequences. Right next door in Zimbabwe, you can speak and have a view, but you will be very suddenly incarcerated and continue to face the consequences of the law. We've seen that with journalists such as Hopewell Chinono. We've seen that with activists, youth activists of the CCC movement who have been incarcerated several times simply for having a view that is different from the ruling party. So one of the things that South Africa has, in contrast to many African countries, is a free and independent media. Obviously, it's contested. Obviously, there have been, detours and different brands which have been captured, etc., etc. But in the main, you do have a media that is able to say Eskom is failing. The president has these limitations. You have opposition that is able to operate and move around. Of course, there are some issues with assassinations in a few provinces, but by and large, we do have those political freedoms. But when you transition into the economic discussion, because that is where the youth are feeling the biggest frustration, and in fact, the median age in South Africa is 28. So the median age has been living in a democratic South Africa, you know, a non-racial post-election South Africa that we're speaking about. And when you look at that, if we were to ask ourselves, where did things go wrong? The fundamental answer is education. The reality is, and people often don't look into this data quite critically, but if you look at how many people get, for instance, over 80% in mathematics, only 1.7% approximately every year get over 80%. These are the people who are most likely to pass the subjects in the STEM field, you know, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics that we say that we need. If you look at a 50% level, only 20% of students who write matric get over 50% in maths, economics, accounting, physical science. What does this mean? It means that there's a systematic exclusion of young people from accessing the jobs of the present and the future.
Right.
Then you factor in the dropout rate. Every year, over 50% of the students don't actually get to write the final exam. They don't even exit school with something that they can take into the workplace.
Mighty Jamie, let me ask you to pause there for a moment so I can throw the same question. And I think let me throw it to you, David Mohale. This promise that says from the late Nelson Mandela, let each know that for each the body, the mind and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves. That was Jamie's take on that question. What's your take?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to Lasizwe. Good evening to you and good evening to the viewers of eNCA. Let me start by saying that sometime during the week I came across some reading which was shared elsewhere, and the author raised something very interesting that in fact the author was raising the question as to whether South Africa as a country could be de-ideologized. And I thought that perhaps if we were to understand the context of human behavior to be deriving from our outlook or paradigm, perhaps that's where we should be starting. If you look, for instance, at the report that was released by Statistics South Africa last month on the social profile of youth, analyzing how the country has been performing from 2014 until 2020, looking at a whole arena of categories that affect the life of young people. Perhaps the question should be, if we appreciate the fact that over 34% of the South African population is people between the age of 14 and 35, therefore the largest population segment, why is it that when it comes to our planning and budgeting, resources do not take that reality into account? And I do think that perhaps if we believe that ideology or the way in which we organize our thinking has got to do with the facts that exist at ground level, I want to submit that perhaps that is our problem. For some of us have been arguing for quite some time that yes, we appreciate the fact that there have been challenges and getting as far as social aspects of development are concerned. For instance, we've got to access to housing. But in a country where you've got the majority of young people, why is it that we continue to invest or allocate resources to housing program, which largely benefits older people, and you continue to have young people that are excluded, which inevitably or unavoidably makes them to be dependent on the state? If you look at between 2014 and 2020, the fact that youth absorption rate in economic participation has declined. You look at the fact that, I mean, yes, that as an example, you look at the dependency rate of young people on their families or parents has continued to increase between the last 6 years. I mean, that's a cause for concern. And I do think, for me, it speaks to two fundamental problems. On the one hand, I think that we have got a generation of older people which do not know when to exit the dance floor. I think they have done their part, and it is about time that they appreciate that perhaps we need new ideas. On the other hand, I think you've got a generation of young people which is comfortable with just a small portion of ourselves being accommodated, instead of saying, I could be okay as David, an individual, But what does that mean in the bigger context of the majority of young people being excluded from economic opportunities? And quite frankly, I do think that is where we are lacking as a nation. I do think that we need to revisit our organizing ideology. And part of that, I want to submit without playing ideological semantics, that I do think that the problem we have in this country, we tend to think that politics is everything. If I were to pretend to be influenced by ideas of Karl Marx, I would say that perhaps we need to be serious about our attitude towards the economy and how we think the structure of the economy influences the content of politics and therefore everything else.
And Dimpo, if I bring you in here, being serious about the structure of the economy naturally dictates that even as we approach Freedom Day, we should be reflecting on the ravages of unemployment on young South Africans. 66.5% is actually the figure, the accurate figure that we have at least at the moment that talks about youth unemployment. And also, if you look at how we framed this discussion, we are asking ourselves, are we now talking about a generation of unfree young South Africans? What's your take?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Thulasizwe. I think, you know, as Jamie mentioned, this is 28 years after democracy, right? And the median age of a South African is 28 years. We are known as born frees. But then you really need to think deeply about what are the things that an individual requires to be free or to at least live some kind of dignified life. And I think to exist in an environment that allows them to thrive, right? And so unemployment is a huge dent on young people's ability to live dignified lives, to thrive, and to contribute, I think, to the social and economic growth of this country. And while we're on the unemployment topic, I think although it's a critical conversation, it's always such a complex one to have because there are so many issues and factors that are at play. You're talking about education, right? And how well our education system is able to prepare young people to be employable, whether at matric or after completing a tertiary qualification. You're looking at a skills mismatch where we have, a set of skills that is being produced through universities and TVET colleges, but young people are coming into kind of like the labor markets with those skills and they're not in demand. But I also think we need to talk about the way in which our economy is growing and the pace at which our economy is growing, which is simply not enough to absorb the number of people who are knocking on doors trying to get into the formal economy every year. And I think part of that reason, or at the core of that problem, is the fact that there's a lack of a clear vision around how we want our economy to grow, right? There's no consolidation between government departments, between things like SOEs and government agencies, and some kind of consolidated effort to say, okay, are we going to put our resources into funding SMMEs and funding startups? Is that the direction we want our economy to go and grow in? Are we going to invest in technology and innovation? Are we going to invest in SOEs because we see that there's an opportunity to create employment there? So there's that misalignment, and I think failure to communicate a clear vision, which means that our economy grows very slowly and sometimes is even stagnant. I think you mentioned that about 7 out of 10 young people are unemployed when we look at the expanded definition of unemployment, right? But when we look at that number for young people who do have a tertiary qualification, it's much lower. I stand to be corrected, but I think it's at around 12%. So higher education does allow young people to be more employable in the formal economy. And so we need to put in a lot more resources in ensuring that young people who are capable and who are deserving are able to access that. And we need to start viewing it as a social investment, right? And not just a commodity that only people who are able to afford it are able to access. And then I also think that, I just want to emphasize the role that crime and corruption plays in keeping people unemployed as well. We've all, heard about the state capture reports, but the thing about crime and corruption is that it slows down the rate of service delivery in our communities.
Sure.
And so it means that communities aren't able to thrive as well as they would have, but also it causes a breakdown in SOEs where there could have been opportunities to employ young people. And so a lack of accountability as far as that is concerned, and I think a lack of decisive action as to how we deal with crime and corruption also contributes to the unemployment problem.
Yeah.
And of course, all of these things have been compounded by like the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which also slowed down and erased some of the small economic gains that we had made over the years.
Right. Ravi, let me bring you into the conversation as well. Being, in a manner of speaking, the surgeon who's been sent in to perform this operation and try and, bring life to the situation around youth unemployment. I saw some figures that were shared, and I don't know how current they are, that talk to some 76,959 or more work experiences created through the youth employment scheme that government has in place. Just your sense then, your overall diagnosis, because, before you tackle the situation, do you share the diagnosis that has been shared by my guests, the first three that have spoken?
Yes, thanks very much for inviting me to the show. So I do share the view that youth today have more freedom in law than they had in 1994, but it's the quality of the freedom, right? So you can have freedom in terms of rights. I think we've also, I was looking at some of the data recently, 1994, only 55% of youth up to the age of 15 were actually in school. If you go, today it's 99%. So it's on paper, it's a much bigger improvement. I was surprised to see that the proportion of the population in informal housing is lower now than it was in 1994. And I'm sure if you went through a list, you could find a number of things where on paper there are improvements. The biggest problem is, and I would share the view then with the rest of the panel, that because you have so many youth unemployed, 6 million, more or less, 2/3, it means you really don't have the economic means or so in terms of being included in the economy and being able to chart your own path as a young person, that is a huge uncertainty. And at the moment, the certainty is more likely to be that you won't have a job unless you are in that 9 out of 10 people that DiPio mentioned who are, graduates. That's who have a much higher chance of getting a job. So the biggest focus really for the youth is youth unemployment. And so I would agree that is the key thing. And there are a number of things that have to be done, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on.
Yeah.
The figure of 76,900 and so on, I think refers to the Youth Employment Service on its own as a special program, which is an initiative supported by government, but it doesn't receive any government money. It's totally private sector funded. It hasn't received 1 rand from government. It's just backed by the government in other ways, but it's funded by the private sector, and its focus is to get youth into their first job, principally in the private sector. But there's a number of other initiatives paid for by the government, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But as a whole, youth employment is the key priority, because if you can't get youth into their first jobs, well, for the future, that has obviously a lot of problems.
All right, let's pause there for a moment and take a quick break. After the break, I'll be asking my guests for a while now, for a number of years, we've been talking about, the youth dividend, whether South Africa is reaping that youth dividend, but also at the same time warning about what people have been calling a ticking time bomb. Well, have we moved from talking about a ticking time bomb to a bomb that's actually either in the initial stages of detonating or actually quite advanced in that process? I'll ask that question coming up in just a moment. Stay with us.